The video you are about to watch is nothing short of shocking. If you've ever wondered how Ezekiel 38 could possibly happen, watch this and you might have a few ideas. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into this one. Folks, I can tell you this right now. Your mind is going to be blown with the video that you watch. Now, once again, I want to remind you, we are going to be going through an interview that Tucker Carlson did with a very specific person I'm going to introduce to you. But you need to understand, if you want to watch the video in its entirety without me interrupting it, then I would highly recommend that you go to Tucker Carlson's website and that you watch the video in its entirety. The purpose for me doing this video is to provide commentary specifically to bring in a biblical perspective for the very things that you are actually going to be listening to. Now, I want to say this. If you have ever wondered anything about Ezekiel 38 and how it could possibly even happen, like if you ever concerned, how in the world could something like this take place? Folks, I'm going to tell you this right now. You are about to find a series of possibilities on how this could work. You're going to learn a lot about geopolitics that you probably have not heard outside of me. And I can tell you this right now, it is going to be nothing short of absolutely eye-opening, and in some cases, just shocking. Now, the person you're going to hear from is an individual by the name of Jeffrey Sachs. Let me read to you the description of who he is right from Tucker Carlson's description on the video that he does for this. It says this: Professor Jeffrey Sachs is the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He is the author of many best-selling books, including The End of Poverty and The Ages of Globalization. Now, let me say this. You might hear me read this introduction that Tucker Carlson wrote about him and who he is and think he's just one of those guys that's in academia that is kind of inconsequential and doesn't really mean a whole lot to the bigger picture of things. But that would be a terrible mistake if that's what you believed, because this guy is absolutely a massive hitter. He is super, super smart. He is probably, in my opinion, one of the most substantial people in diplomacy that has probably ever existed in our modern time. And he has a very thorough and deep understanding of operations as they sit with other nations, especially as it relates to Russia and Europe and many of the things that the United States does. You are going to be blown away. In this video, what we're going to actually do is we're going to go over a good portion of this interview, but we're not going to go over all of it. Again, the reminder here is I'm going to provide biblical commentary on this to give you some deeper insight as into what you're seeing and make a little bit more sense of it. And I'm telling you right now, you are definitely going to want to, at some point or another, go back and listen even to the last half of this interview that we're not going to go over here, because it is remarkably eye-opening, especially when he speaks concerning the subject of COVID and so on and so forth. It is unbelievable what this guy has to offer, but it makes a whole lot of sense. And it's really important that you understand and know and realize what's actually happening here. Now, a couple of things we have to go over before we watch this video. Number one, we have to talk about Ezekiel 38. Now, all of you know what Ezekiel 38 is all about. We've talked about this. We've talked about Russia and the situation of what's going to actually happen. We know that when we look at the whole picture of Ezekiel 38, matter of fact, let's put up a map of it so you can see what's going to end up happening. I think this map is very important for you to be able to look at and understand and know, because of it will sort of help to develop a picture of what you can expect to see when this takes place. So let me put up this map so that I can better describe what actually happens according to Ezekiel 38. I love this map. This is one that Andy Woods put together, and it's a very, very good map. But when you look at this, according to Ezekiel 38, we see this battle that is referred to as the Gog-Magog battle. Now, a lot of people think that Gog is an actual person. Actually, Gog is a title, presumably the title of the leader of Rosh, which of course is Russia. And we are talking about the leader of Russia, who is leading a group of nations, particularly in the region of Magog, which of course would be specifically Central Asia, against the nation of Israel. When we start looking at the nations that are going to come against Israel, we see who they are. Rosh, of course, being Russia. Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah is Turkey. We talk about Put, which of course is Libya. Cush, which is Sudan. Persia, which is Iran. When we look at Magog, which of course is a region, this is where we cover nations like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and then there's a few other nations that aren't shown on this map that are actually going to be attacking Israel. Now, the interesting set of facts that we have after looking at this map, now that you guys kind of have an idea of what's going to end up happening, is something really, really important and critical for you to understand, and that is, according to what we know in Ezekiel 38, there are some facts that are relatively irrefutable. Okay, first of all, the thing you have to understand is the fact that this, I believe, happens after the rapture. I base that on what I read in Ezekiel chapter 39, where God says he's dealing directly with Israel, which speaks of the time that we're actually in. And of course, that would make a whole lot of sense. So that's one thing we should know. The second thing that we should know is that during the time that this attack takes place, Israel is going to be friendly with all of its attackers. Now, that's something that's really interesting here and uniquely consequential to understanding what happens in Ezekiel 38. So the other thing that we should know, and yes, this one is also a very critical detail, centers around the role of Russia in the world during this time. And based on what we can gather from Ezekiel 38, it would appear as though there is no other superpower in the world. I don't believe that the United States of America will be a superpower. I don't think China will be a superpower. And yes, I know that there are many that will completely disagree with me on this, but it doesn't appear that that's going to be the case. And this is the reason why, because Russia will, in essence, lead this conglomerate of nations in attacking Israel, and the whole world will do nothing about it. Saudi Arabia will object to it, of course. There will be other nations that will clearly not be in support of this by virtue of the fact that they do nothing. But the reality of the circumstance that we read about in Ezekiel 38 lends us to the understanding that there will be nobody that will be able to, militaristically speaking, overcome Russia, including Israel. God has to do that. And in order for Israel to find any victory, God will be the one that intervenes, and it will be the work of God that creates this condition by which we see this victory, okay? So these are all very important things, and the reason why I think it's important for me to share this with you is because I want to re-emphasize one very important fact, and that is the fact that I believe that the United States of America will become inconsequential within the context of Bible prophecy, specifically here within Ezekiel 38. Now, you might say, well, how in the world does that happen? Well, look at this interview because you will get a very good glimpse on how quickly things can become inconsequential when a series of very bad decisions are being made. Make no mistake, folks, when we talk about Russia invading, as they say, Ukraine, we make it look like Russia are the evil, bad, terrible people, when in reality, as I have said on multiple occasions before, Russia was forced into this. This was not some act of nobility that the United States is taking on to prevent some terrible leader from jumping in. Putin was literally backed into a corner and he was forced into doing this. And this is exactly what Tucker and, of course, Jeffrey Sachs start talking about right off the bat. So let's get into this. Let's pay attention. A quick warning. I know that there are some people, not a lot, that oftentimes are commenting on how bothered they am when I provide commentary on this. The whole purpose of this video is for me to provide commentary and bring in biblical precedent for the things that we're actually seeing. So if you don't like that, my recommendation is you go to that video and that you watch it in its entirety. I actually believe that you should go to the video and watch it in its entirety even after you watch this video, because it is just remarkable. What you see here is going to be mind-boggling, okay? So I'm going to walk you through this. It's going to be a lot of fun. Let's watch and see what happens here.
Okay, so the one thing that we heard about the movement of Russian troops into eastern Ukraine in February of 2022 was it was unprovoked. Here's a selection of what we know about that.
The Russian military has begun a brutal assault on the people of Ukraine without provocation, without justification, without necessity. This is a premeditated attack.
Russia's unprovoked and cruel invasion has galvanized countries from around the world.
Russia's unprovoked and unjustified attack on Ukraine.
Russia conducted an unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine.
This unprovoked Russian war of aggression has got to be met with strength.
Vladimir Putin decided, unprovoked, to start this war.
I mean, just tell you this right now, these people are all a bunch of liars. You're going to see Tucker dig into this a little bit, and you wait until you hear what comes out. It's going to blow your mind. But all of these people completely lied through their teeth. As a matter of fact, I want you to understand something. This is really, really important. And I'm going to say this a lot because it is important, right? These people, all of the ones that you see, by the way, including Mike Pence, were individuals who provoked Russia to do something that Russia should have never been provoked into doing. Russia was forced into doing this. They had to do it to fight for the existence of their nation, okay? You need to understand this. I'm not justifying anybody's actions here, but what I am saying is that what we did as the United States of America and many people in Europe did was absolutely reprehensible. This was done for one purpose, and that was to feed this ugly, nasty war machine. And the reality of it is we didn't have to do this. As a matter of fact, I made multiple videos where I warned people about what was coming. I said, even when we started to see the president of Belarus begin to say what he was saying before this happened in Russia, back in 2021, I made videos where I warned everybody. I said, look, I'm telling you, Putin just told NATO to off themselves, or he was going to do it. Why? Because NATO was aggressively expanding in direct opposition to the promises that were made to Yeltsin at the time that things had happened when they had happened, or Gorbachev. This nonsense is continuing to manifest its ugly face. But the reality of it is most people would never know because of the lies that the media are saying concerning this. So let's take a look at this and watch what happens next in this interview.
So was it unprovoked?
Well, we did hear that a lot of times.
Yes, we did.
I actually asked a research assistant of mine to count how many times we heard that in the New York Times in that first year from February 2022 to February 2023 in their opinion columns. It was 26 times unprovoked.
26 times. You tell a lie long enough, often enough, then eventually the people will believe it. It's Hitler. Yeah, that's what's going on here.
Of course, things aren't unprovoked.
It's
that
almost
way.
A brand name, the unprovoked invasion.
It's the lazy person's dodge for actually trying to think through what's going on,
Yes.
and it's very dangerous because it's wrong. It gets the whole story completely wrong. And it misunderstands the trap that we set for ourselves as the United States to push Ukraine deeper and deeper and deeper into this hopeless mess that they're in right now.
So in what sense was it provoked? Like, what started this?
Basically, it started very simply, which is that the United States government, let's not call it the U.S. people, they had nothing to do with this, but the U.S. government said, we're going to put Ukraine on our side, and we're going to go right up to that 2,100 kilometer border with Russia. We're going to put our troops and NATO and maybe missiles, whatever we want, because we are the sole superpower of the world and we do what we want. And it goes back actually a long way. It goes back 170 years. The Brits had this idea first, surround Russia in the Black Sea region, and Russia's not a great power anymore. And that was Lord Palmerston's idea in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856. And the Brits taught us what we know about empire. And they basically taught us the idea, Russia, it needs an outlet. It needs an outlet to the Middle East. It needs an outlet to the Mediterranean. You surround Russia in the Black Sea. You have rendered Russia a second or third rate country. And Zbig Brzezinski, one of our lead geostrategists of the current era, wrote in 1997, let's do this. Let's make sure that we basically surround Russia in the Black Sea region. They got this idea that we'll expand NATO so that every country in the Black Sea around Russia is a NATO country. Right now, back then, Turkey was a NATO country. But we said, okay, we'll get Romania and Bulgaria, and we'll get Ukraine, and we'll get Georgia. Now, Georgia, not our Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Georgia of the Black Sea.
We used to call it Soviet Georgia.
Yes, Soviet Georgia, if you want to call it that.
Home of Stalin.
It's not NATO North Atlantic. It's way out there on the eastern edge of the Black Sea region. People can look at a map. But we said, yeah, we'll make Georgia part of NATO too. And the reason was very clear, and Zbig was very explicit about it, that this is our way to basically dominate Eurasia. If we can dominate the Black Sea region, then Russia's nothing. If we make Russia nothing, then we can basically control Eurasia, meaning all the way from Europe to Central Asia, and through our influence in East Asia, do the same thing. And that's American unipolarity. We run the world. We are the hegemon. We are the sole superpower. We are unchallenged.
So I just want to make this very, very clear. This is very, very typical right now of American foreign policy. It has been typical of American foreign policy for as long as I can possibly remember. The only time American foreign policy was not reflective of the view that Mr. Sachs is talking about is during the small portion of time when President Trump was actually the president. He was more about wanting to make peace with the people around him than he was wanting to build the military-industrial complex in a way that was like this big game of command and conquer. He's going to refer to risk here in this interview, but you have to understand that that is exactly what's been going on. And the whole idea behind dominating these countries that, of course, surround the Black Sea is really, really critical in the process that these people were trying to institute, specifically the United States of America, were trying to institute. And I'm not talking about the people of America. I'm talking about these crazy, insane neocons, these rulers, these deep staters, and eventually a portion of the globalist crowd. What these people have always wanted was to dominate every single nation in the world. By the way, we've talked about this. This is why there has been a massive stronghold in Ukraine from before World War II. In Ukraine, we have seen a absolutely massive amount of clandestine operators, all of which belong to the United States of America, who were in Ukraine and still in Ukraine because Ukraine was the home base for a lot of the nonsense that they created. By the way, we were partially responsible for many of the things that happened in Germany during World War II, and there's a lot to say about this. So I just want you to understand, America, or at least the blood that is on the hands of American leaders, is not washed off, okay? These are people who clearly are part of a strong movement to build the war machine because it's all about the ruling class. We read about this, by the way. Revelation chapter 6, when we get into the rider of the white horse, that's of course the Antichrist. Then we get into the rider of the red horse. That is an immediate thing. When you have totalitarianism, you immediately bring in war. Once war is brought in, you've got the rider of the black horse, which is economic collapse or failure. But the more critical portion to pay attention to in the rider of the black horse is, of course, the idea of not touching the oil and the wine. That is speaking of a ruling class, a very specific ruling class. And what is critically important to understand is that this ruling class is, of course, going to be the group of people that are responsible for ushering us into what will eventually be the rider of the pale horse, which will be massive death. Now, we see microcosms of this taking place right now. Remember, the church has not been raptured, and the Bible says that the very thing that preserves the world from completely going haywire and bonkers are Christians on this earth. So you can imagine, with the destructive force of this type of mindset while Christians are here on this earth, you can imagine what it's going to look like when we're raptured, okay? So right now, they're being led by these deep staters. They're being led by these sort of discombobulated world leaders that have a specific purpose, by a cabal. Eventually, that's all going to be led by the Antichrist. It's really important to understand the parallels here and why this means something and why it matters. Okay, so let's continue on.
So that's the idea.
But why would you want that? Why would the Brits want that? Why does the U.S. State Department want that? What about Russia, which is not actually much of an expansionist power, is so threatening?
So this is important pay attention to what Jeffrey Sachs says here, because Tucker's asking a very good question, especially when we start talking about the mechanism of expansionism. You would think that Russia would not be sort of the ideal place to gather around and to create sort of an effort to come against. But what he says here is brilliant, because he's making a connection that's going to be very, very, very difficult for some people to really understand. So, and by the way, it's difficult for virtually anybody to understand if you're not really familiar with the deeper side of the geopolitical spectrum that exists here, right? Especially when you start talking about America's deep state, especially when you start talking about these operators who are clandestine operators that exist within Ukraine, especially when we talk about the intelligence agencies. When we talk about all these things, it makes a substantial difference to understand the whys of this, okay? Because it is a very valid question that Tucker is asking. These two men that are talking right now are reasonably minded men. They don't want war. They don't want anybody to be fighting back and forth. They don't want difficulties. They want their children and children's children to live a peaceful life. But these neocons have no desire for any of that. They're wicked, evil people, because they themselves believe they will be or remain unaffected by all the things that are actually happening. By the way, it's interesting. They won't be unaffected. As a matter of fact, you should probably go to the Calvary Chapel Signal Hill live page, which is the YouTube channel that I actually do my Bible teachings on, and you should look up the passages that I teach in Revelation chapter 19, where God comes as judge and he deals with all of these people. Matter of fact, I just finished teaching Revelation 19 verses 15 through 21 to the very end, and we talk about God and his final judgment, right? So these people think they're getting away with it, but they're not going to get away with it. By the way, if you ever needed material for me, any of my Bible studies that I teach, or anything else that you might forget about, or might not remember where to go with this channel or that channel, just go to my website, jameskaddis.com. In my website, jameskaddis.com, I have it all in one place. You can go there. There's always plenty of material there to be able to grasp, and it's all centralized in that location. All right, let's continue on here.
It's not about Russia. It's about the U.S. It's about Britain before that. I think it's a little bit like that old game of Risk. I don't know if you played that as a kid, but the idea was have your piece on every place in the world. You know, that was the game. And you read the American strategists, whether it's Zbigniew Brzezinski, although he was very moderate, or the neocons who have run U.S. foreign policy for the last 30 years. The neocons are very explicit. The U.S. must be the unchallenged superpower in every place in the world, in every region. We must dominate. It's quite a load for us American people. What they say is we are going to be the constabulary duty holder. What fancy word for saying we'll be the world's policeman. They say it explicitly. They say that's lots of wars. We have to be ready for all these wars. To my mind, it's a little crazy. But their idea was, after the end of the Soviet Union, well, now we run the world. And to come back to Russia, the idea was, well, Russia's weak. It's down. We're the sole superpower. They're on their back or on their knees, whatever it is. And now we can move NATO where we want, and we can surround them. And the Russians said, please don't do that. Don't bring your troops, your weapons, your missiles right up to our border. It's not a good idea. And the U.S., I was around in those years, involved in Russia and in Central Europe. The U.S. was, we don't hear you. We don't hear you. We do what we want. They kept pushing inside the U.S. government in the 1990s when this debate was going, should NATO expand? Some people said, yeah, but we told Gorbachev and we told Yeltsin we weren't going to expand at all. No, come on. The Soviet Union's done. We can do what we want. We're the sole superpower. Clinton bought into that. That was Madeleine Albright's line. NATO enlargement started. And our most sophisticated diplomats, we used to have diplomats at the time. We don't have them anymore, but we used to have diplomats like George Kennan, said this is the greatest mistake we could possibly make. We had a defense secretary, Bill Perry, who was Clinton's defense secretary who agonized, God, I should resign over this. This is terrible. What's going on? But he was outmaneuvered diplomatically by Richard Holbrooke and by Madeleine Albright, and Clinton never thought through anything systematically, in my opinion. And so they decided, okay, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, first round. And then Brzezinski, in a 1997 article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which is kind of the bellwether of foreign policy, wrote a strategy for Eurasia where he laid out exactly the timeline for this U.S. expansion of power. And he said late 1990s, we'll take in Central Europe, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. By the early 2000s, we'll take in the Baltic states. Now that's getting close to Russia. By 2005 to 2010, we'll invite Ukraine to become part of NATO. So this wasn't some flippant thing. This was a long-term plan, and it was based on a long-term geostrategy. Now the Russians are saying, are you kidding? We wanted peace. We ended the Cold War too. You didn't just defeat us. We said no more. We disbanded the Warsaw Pact. We wanted peace. We wanted cooperation. You call it victory. We just wanted to cooperate. I know that for a fact because I was there in those years.
Okay, so this is really important to understand. He says he knows this for a fact because he was there in those years, and what he is saying is absolutely correct. Make no mistake about all of this, folks. I want to give you some deeper analysis into what is being said here. This was absolutely about the United States. This was absolutely about Britain in many ways. These were people, especially during the Clinton era, these were people who believed that they were God. They took the place of God. This is literally the spirit of Antichrist. This is the biblical terminology for all of this is indeed that, the spirit of Antichrist. Antichrist does not mean against Christ. It means instead of Christ. And what you have to understand, and this is critically important, these people have collectively removed the consciousness of God amongst their whole surrounding by assuming the role of God themselves. So when they believe they're God, they can rule as God, and they are dragging the people of the United States of America and the Republic for which it stands into a place of dramatic judgment. Okay? They put us in a terrible place because they themselves assume or believe themselves to be God, and they are not God. And of course, this is a massive problem. And of course, Russia sees all this and says, look, we made peace with you. We don't want this. And the United States of America says, I don't care if we promise you we're going to make peace. Pretty much, we're God and we can do anything we want. You need to understand the history of this. If you don't understand the history of this, it's not going to make sense. By the way, I would highly recommend that you go through the interview that Tucker did with Putin himself, the one that I actually commented on because I talk about a lot of this stuff, guys. This is the type of stuff we've been talking about for a long time. Understand what's happening here. This is the United States of America taking the lives of Ukrainians and saying, we don't care, better they die than we do, and using them to accomplish their purpose in a proxy war with Russia, fully being unaware of, because of their arrogance, that they will never win a proxy war with Russia. They wouldn't win a direct war with Russia. Russia is too resolved and will not allow this type of thing to happen. These are all critical points to understand, and this is why this has continued to be a losing policy of the United States of America. And again, when we start looking at the foreign policy tentacles of this, it's creating a bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger problem. So let's go on to hear what he has to say about this. But I thought I wanted to stop to just remind everybody of this because it is a very serious issue.
What Gorbachev wanted, what Yeltsin wanted. They didn't want war with the United States, nor were they saying we're defeated. They were saying we just want to cooperate. We want to stop the Cold War. We want to become part of a world economy. We want to be a normal economy. We want to be normal society connected with you, connected with Europe, connected with Asia. And the U.S. said, we get it. We won. You do everything we say, and we determine how the pieces are going to go. So in the early 2000s, Putin comes in. First business for Putin was good cooperation with Europe.
Yes.
You go back to the early 2000s. Again, I know the people. I watched closely. I was a participant in some of it. Putin was completely pro-Europe.
Yes.
and pro-U.S., by the way.
I know.
And we don't want to talk about this. We don't want to admit it because we don't want anything other than unprovoked. So everything is phony, what we say. Everything is a lie. But just to say, the U.S. kept doing unilateral things that were really outrageous. In 1999, we bombed Belgrade for 78 days. Bad move. Absolutely. We bombed a capital of Europe for 78 days.
By the way, that bombing in Belgrade, I just want everybody to know, that was undoubtedly, in my opinion, just we're doing it because we're going to do it. We want to show our force. One thing that he may not mention in this interview, and I don't know if he did, but Putin mentions it in his interview with Tucker, and that is early on, he actually goes to Clinton and says, I want to be a member of NATO. Like, I want to cooperate that much. Remember, the purpose of the existence of NATO was to defend the rest of the world from the USSR. The USSR is disbanded, and now the Russian Federation wants to go and say, we want to work with you guys. We want to be a member of NATO. Think about that. Do you know how wonderful that could have been? Do you understand the value that could have brought to the rest of the world? But of course, we know the United States of America, not the people of the U.S., but the leaders, the government, the deep state, their whole idea is, I'm God. They believe that they are God. So the wickedness that we see, this is in the Bush, the Clinton era. We are talking about both Bush eras, the Clinton era. Look, George Bush Sr. was talking about a new world order. As a matter of fact, we have a video of it. Let me show you. This is George Bush Sr. talking about a new world order.
What is at stake is more than one small country. It is a big idea. A new world order where diverse nations are drawn together in common cause to achieve the universal aspirations of mankind: peace and security, freedom, and the rule of law.
So there you have it, folks. I mean, these are all people that are complicit. You're talking about George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., Clinton, Obama, especially Obama. I mean, all of these people are all deep state operatives, and this has existed for long, even before them, right? I think it's gotten substantially worse during their time, but let's just face it for what things are. Look, even the things that happened in Kuwait and Iraq at the time that they happened under Bush Sr., folks, so much of this was unjustified behavior, right? But it was one of those things, we're going to do it because we're going to do it. We're going to take our assets. We're going to take what we want because we're God and you're not. And that's the mindset that they have. And the Bible speaks about this explicitly. The Bible talks about this. Folks, we shouldn't be surprised. Pay attention to what Tucker Carlson next asks, because this becomes really consequential to the rest of the conversation.
Looking back, what was the point of that?
The point of that was to break Serbia in two, create a new state, Kosovo, where we have the largest NATO military base in Southeast Europe. We put Bondesteel base there because we wanted a base in Southeastern Europe. And again, you look at the neocons. It's nice of them. They actually describe all of this in various documents. You have to make the links. But in a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses in the year 2000, they say the Balkans is a new strategic area for the U.S., so we have to move large troops to the Balkans, because their idea is literally the game of Risk. Not just you need good relations or peace. We need our pieces on the board. We need military bases with the advanced positioning of our military everywhere in the world. So they wanted a big base in Southeastern Europe. They didn't like Serbia. Serbia was close to Russia. Anyway, we're the sole superpower. We do what we want. So they divided the country, which they now claim you never do. You never change borders. We broke apart Serbia, established by our declaration, a new country, Kosovo. We put a huge NATO base there, and that was the goal.
Yeah, and before he goes on, I want to say this, guys. This has been a longstanding issue. Like, if you wonder what Hitler did and you think, oh, it was so bad, of course it was terrible. He killed a lot of people. And in the process of killing a lot of people, he exactly went out to do much of what we've seen these deep state, neocons doing, right? It's the same kind of thing. There's no difference between him on a lot of levels and someone like Rumsfeld, okay? What they were doing was they were going out of their way to obtain assets through the destruction of countries and lives. And as a matter of fact, if it looks oddly familiar from the time of World War II, understand World War II on many levels was in essence the function of the actions and the behavior of clandestine operators at the direction of these deep staters. I want you guys to understand, go back and look at some of the symbols of the early regimes in communism. You'll see the big hand out there. You'll see the early symbols. If you look at some of the symbols today of like Black Lives Matter and some of these other type of symbols, it's the same exact symbol. This is these people's way of slapping you in the face and almost publicly flipping you off and saying this is the way it's going to be. They use these tactics to brainwash people, to get people all lit up, to make them all go crazy. These are the types of things that we're witnessing right now in the day and time that we're living, folks, and it's getting darker. Folks, listen to me. I'm telling you this. It's getting darker. It's getting darker. It's going to cut to the point where the Lord is going to have to intervene, and we know biblically that he will. Okay? Let's continue on.
That was 1999.
So it wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population?
Excuse me?
It wasn't to save the oppressed Muslim population?
It was...
There's some sarcasm there right now.
very, very much to save the military-industrial complex to have a nice location in southeastern Europe.
There you go. Killed all those people, wrecked the city.
It was a little bit sad, but we do lots of sad things and lots of destructive things, lots of wars. We're the country of perpetual war. We don't look back. We're not even supposed to talk about this because this was unprovoked, remember? So in 2002, the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Unilaterally. Well, that was one of the stabilizers of the relationship with Russia, and it was one of the stabilizers of the global nuclear situation, which is absolutely dangerous. And the U.S. unilaterally started putting Aegis missiles into first Poland, then Romania. And the Russians are saying, wait a minute, what do we know you're putting in this? You're a few minutes from Moscow. This is completely destabilizing. Do you think you might want to talk to us? So then comes 2004, 7 more countries in NATO, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, filling in the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria. Suddenly, they're now North Atlantic countries, but it's all part of this design, all spelled out, all quite explicit. We're surrounding Russia. In 2007, President Putin gave a very...
Before he gets into 1997, before he gets into Putin here, I want to mention something because it's really important, right? We use the term NATO a lot. For some of you that might not know, it is in essence an acronym, and it is for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's very interesting what's happened because when you start looking at NATO nations, and we'll bring up a map of NATO nations here, because there's a very, very good indicator here of what those nations are. When you start looking at the nations of NATO, originally they were, in essence, North Atlantic nations, okay? So you would talk about Canada, United States, you talk about Spain, France, United Kingdom, and so on and so forth. These were the type of nations that were sort of involved in this, right? But then as NATO began to expand, and we have to show you this on the map, they began to go in the direction of the Black Sea, which of course is a substantial threat to Russia, because the more nations that you have that are NATO nations, the more restrictive it becomes for the Russian Federation, because the Russian Federation is no longer able to literally live or provide security for itself. And when you look at this map, you'll be able to see it. It's not difficult to understand why this is such a critical situation. It's really, really important that you see this, folks. It's critical. And this map, it will show you all about why this is such a dangerous place to be playing in, right? Very important that we see this. Very critical, okay? So you can't blame Putin for feeling the way he's feeling and acting out the way that he's acting. By the way, all of this has relevance to Ezekiel 38. Why? Because Russia will eventually, with a conglomerate of nations, attack Israel. And when it happens, none of the world will be there to stop it. By the way, it would be in the best interest of the rest of the world to stop Russia from doing that, because if Russia can take possession of Israel, Russia then completely owns the Mediterranean, right? Because they're in alliance with Turkey, as we know this. They're in alliance with Libya, as we read about this in Ezekiel 38. Egypt is pretty quiet, but when you begin to see how all of this begins to work together, they own the Mediterranean, and that would not be in the best interest of anybody. But nobody's going to be able to stop them, which tells us they will be the superpower of the time. So the idea behind wanting to continue to fight and make war, what these people don't realize is as they continue to pretend as though they're God and act like they're God, they're actually making the way for what God said is going to happen in the Bible. Folks, like, get that. Please recognize this for what it is. It's pretty substantial stuff here. Pretty substantial.
A clear speech at the Munich Security Conference. Very powerful, very correct, very frustrated, where he said, gentlemen, you told us in 1990 NATO would never enlarge. That was the promise made to President Gorbachev, and it was the promise made to President Yeltsin. And you cheated. And you repeatedly cheated. And you don't even admit that you said this, but it's all plainly documented, by the way, and as you know, in 1,000 archival sites, so it's easy to verify all of this. James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. And it wasn't a flippant statement. It was a statement repeated and repeated and repeated. Hans Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, same story. The Germans wanted reunification. Gorbachev said, we'll support that, but we don't want that to come at our expense. No, it won't come at your expense. NATO won't move 1 inch eastward, Mr. President. Repeated so many times in many documents, many statements by the NATO Secretary General, by the U.S. Secretary of State, by the German Chancellor. Now, of course, all denied by our foreign policy blob, because we're not supposed to remember anything. Remember, this was all unprovoked. So back to 2007, Putin gives this speech and he says, stop. Don't even think about Ukraine. This is our 2,100 kilometer border. This is absolutely part of the integrated economy of this region. Don't even think about it. Now, I know from insiders, from all of the diplomatic work that I do, that Europe was saying to the U.S., European leaders, don't think about Ukraine, please. This is not a good idea. Just stop. We know from our current CIA director, Bill Burns, that he wrote a very eloquent, impassioned, articulate, clear, secret, as usual, memo, which we only.
By the way, before he gets into the memo, I do want to bring this up because I think it's really important, right? If you go to a Ukrainian right now and you tell them, I love the Ukraine, or you use the term the Ukraine instead of saying Ukraine, they're going to be upset by that. Let me tell you why. The presence of the definite article emphasizes an aspect of what Ukraine actually is and always has been historically, that many Ukrainians don't like, especially those that are not sympathetic towards the Russian cause. The word Ukraine means borderland. So when you talk about Ukraine as in the Ukraine, they don't like you saying the Ukraine because that would imply the borderland of Russia. Russia has always viewed Ukraine as being that area that borders that sort of southwest section of the country. And this is very important that we understand that, right? And Ukraine has always been regarded as such. This is precisely why it's been critical, absolutely critical to Russia that Ukraine not be touched by NATO. That's why it's been critical that Belarus has been preserved, because that's the nation that is, of course, north of Ukraine, and of course, very, very critical to Russia's western border. Okay, remember, on Russia's western border, you've already got members of NATO that are problematic. You've got Finland and you've got several other nations. And the reality of it is, when you stop for one moment to consider what you're looking at when you look at this map, you cannot blame Putin for saying what he's saying. This is really important that you guys understand this. Ukraine has always been the Ukraine. It is the borderlands of Russia. Very difficult for some people to understand. But if you don't know the map, which, by the way, I would just say this, most of these crazy neocons wouldn't be able to identify where Ukraine is even on the map. I'm telling you that right now. I'm sorry, but that's just the case. Okay? And by the way, Ukraine is particularly important because of what's further south, which is Crimea, which of course is an access way to a body of water really critical to Russia. Okay? So again, these are very, very, very important. It's critically important that people understand why this actually matters. If Ukraine is gone and Russia doesn't have access to it, then Russia is limited as into how it accesses Turkey to the north. Right now, I'm not talking about Turkey being to the north of Russia. Turkey's to the south of Russia, but Turkey's north is a body of water where you can, of course, access into Russia, and that's a very important gateway for both nations, right? Not a surprise that Turkey is one of the conglomerate of nations that attacks with Russia when they do, okay? You have to understand this stuff because this will help you better be able to understand Ezekiel 37, or I keep saying Ezekiel 37, Ezekiel 38. It will help you to be able to better understand it.
Got to see because WikiLeaks showed to the American people what maybe we would like to know once in a while, but we're never told.
Like what our government's doing.
What they're doing and how they're putting us at nuclear risk and other things. Okay, this one did get out, and it's called Niet means Niet, no means no. And what Bill Burns very perceptively, articulately conveys to Condoleezza Rice and back to the White House in 2008 is, Ukraine is really a red line. Don't do it. It's not just Putin. It's not just Putin's government. It's the entire political class of Russia. And just to help all of us as we think about it, it is exactly as if Mexico said, we think it would be great to have Chinese military bases on the Rio Grande. We can't see why the U.S. would have any problem with that. Of course, we would go completely insane. And we should. And we should, of course. It's the whole idea is so absurdly dangerous and reckless that you can't even imagine grown-ups doing this. So what happens is, for what I'm told by European leaders, and by long, detailed discussion, Bush Jr. says to them, "No, it's okay. Don't worry. I hear you about Ukraine." And then he goes off for the Christmas holidays and comes back, whether it's Cheney, whether it's Bush, whatever it is, says, NATO's going to enlarge to Ukraine. And the Europeans are shocked, pissed. What are you doing?
And I understand this, by the way. The Europeans being shocked, the Europeans going crazy, the Europeans, all of that. Of course they are. Stop for a second. Imagine. Picture Russia for just one moment. Folks, the Russian Federation is massive. Do you honestly think you're going to be able to, literally just pick a war with them? Look, let me give you an idea of how big Russia is, okay? Russia is so big that when you look at its northwest border, you are dealing with the Pacific Ocean. When you deal with its northeast border and all the way into the southeast, you're talking about the Pacific Ocean. Folks, when you start looking at the northeastern tip of Russia, you start getting into the Aleutian Islands. You are getting very close to Alaska, folks. That's how big Russia is. You go to the south of Russia, you've got Kazakhstan, you've got Mongolia. You actually, look, Russia even is a rock throw away from Japan. And actually part of Russia borders the northeastern portion of China, okay? You think for 1 second Russia is not going to take seriously everything that's around them? Everybody in Europe knows what an absolute disaster something like this could potentially be. Like, you guys have to get this. This could be beyond a world war. This could be terrible. And with the sheer size of Russia, there's no way in the world that these guys are going to be successful in doing what they're doing. That's why the Europeans are like, no way. They're ticked. Don't do this. But I'm telling you, but look, Bush Jr. especially, his dad too, they're all about making war. They are the perfect example of what deep state looks like on the left and the right. They're all the same people. Birds of the same feather flock together, folks. These are all the same evil people. It's important we understand this, and that's why what this professor is saying is so unbelievably critical. Jeffrey Sachs is so right on. I'm really shocked, by the way, that these guys, I don't know how they're going to remain alive. I mean, I got to tell you, with the kind of truth that they're bringing forth, how in the world are they not in danger? Like, it's amazing when you think about it, right? It's absolutely amazing. Okay, let's continue on.
Bush did not make that decision.
Bush did not make the decision?
Right. I mean, it sounds, if I'm hearing what you're saying.
I'm saying?
Yeah.
No, Bush did make the decision.
Okay, but
what I'm saying is he had told the Europeans, I hear you, I'm not going to do it.
But it sounds like he was influenced by the people around him.
That could be. Yeah, I don't know whether it was CIA or whether someone explained to him or whether someone said, George, Mr. President.
I'm almost certain that it was the CIA. I'm almost certain that there were lots of influences that related to the cabal that was ruling him. I'm certain that he was reminded of the fact that, hey, you're the president because we say you're the president. You're going to do what you're going to do. By the way, Bush, their family is among some of the most corrupt people in the world. If you think that the Bushes were actually good people on a whole lot of levels, let me tell you something. I believed that for a long time until I realized just how evil they were. Some of the darkness that these people have given themselves to. So no, it's all about expanding the war machine, and that's what the Bushes were very, very, very good at doing. Cheney was probably the worst of them. And of course, look at the daughter he produced. What a terrible human being. But that's a whole other story. All of this stuff, you guys, is all the epitome of darkness and wickedness and evil. This is the kind of thing that we should be expecting to see.
This is a long-standing project. It's not something for a European country to object to. I don't know what happened there, but what I do know is that he came back and told the European leaders, no, we're doing it. They said, no, we're not doing it. And then they had the NATO summit in Bucharest, and this was 2008. And the Europeans, Chancellor Merkel, French president, all of them, George, don't do this. Don't do this. This is extraordinarily dangerous. This is really provocative. We don't really need or want NATO right up to the Russian border.
By the way, the reason why they're saying that are for a lot of reasons. Perhaps the most significant of those reasons is the fact that all of these nations that are going to Bush and saying, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, are the very same people that are super dependent upon the energy that's coming from Russia. You look at the map of Russia, you see how expansive that area is. There's a lot of offshore drilling happening all around the Russian coasts. There's all kinds of resources that are available in Russia. Russia is a massive, massive place providing a lot to the rest of the world. The reality of it is an overwhelming majority of the people in Europe understand what it's all about, which is why they don't want to mess with Russia, right? So this whole thing that's going on in Ukraine is ridiculous. It's just absolutely ridiculous. This is all insane warmongering. It's insane warmongering. If Zelensky wasn't able to do the evil that he's doing, this would have been over a long time ago. I mean, a long time ago. And of course, these Europeans know it. They know that they're going to suffer as a result of all of this.
Bush pushed. This is a U.S. alliance fundamentally, and they made the commitment. Ukraine will become a member of NATO. The dodge was, okay, we won't give them exactly the roadmap right now, but Ukraine will become a member of NATO. Because in those days, the U.S. and Russia met in a NATO partnership, even then, Putin was there the next day in Bucharest saying, don't do this. This is completely reckless. Essentially, this is our fundamental red line. Do not do this. The U.S. can't hear any of this. This is our biggest problem of all, because the neocons who have run the show for 30 years believe the U.S. can do whatever it wants. This is the most fundamental point to understand about U.S. foreign policy. They're wrong. They keep screwing up. They keep getting us into trillion-dollar-plus wars. They keep killing a lot of people. But their basic belief is the U.S. is the only superpower. It's the unipolar power, and we can do what we want. So they could not hear Putin. Even that moment, they couldn't hear the rest of the Europeans. And by the way, they said Georgia would become part of NATO. So again,
like Georgia will become a part of NATO. And you wonder why Putin goes into Georgia, right? And of course, this was during the time of Obama when that happened. And notice how it was that we really didn't do anything when Putin goes into Georgia. Why? Because the rest of the world understood the fundamental problem that would exist with such a resistance to that operation. And again, it all goes back to these things. Even when you look at what happened with Georgia, folks, this kind of stuff was stuff that was created prominently and predominantly by the United States of America. Guys, a lot of this stuff is so consequential to the overall picture. I have to get you guys to see this. This is serious, right? Again, this goes to speaking to the issues of Ezekiel 38 and understanding the kind of power that we know Russia will become and already is. It's important, right? Very important step. The United States of America and the neocons in the United States of America that are assuming the role of God and trying to play the game that they're playing, God is going to let them fall apart as a result of their foolishness, and Russia will be used by God to affect what he says will happen in the last days. This is why I'm so resistant to the nonsense and the rhetoric that continues on about Russia. People are mistaken about this. Putin is simply acting in the best interest of the country that he is leading. It's important to understand.
Only way to understand that is in this long-standing Palmerston-Brzezinski theory. This isn't just haphazard. Oh, why don't we take Georgia? This is a plan. Okay, the Russians understand every single step of this. So another thing goes awry. What goes awry? The Ukrainians don't want NATO enlargement. The Ukrainians don't want it. They're against it. The public opinion said, no, this is very dangerous. Neutrality, it's safer. We're in between East and West. We don't want this. So they elect Viktor Yanukovych, a president that says, we'll just be neutral. And that's absolutely the U.S.'s, oh, what the hell is this? Ukraine? They don't have any choice either. So
just keep in mind, Yanukovych, so he was removed, in essence, by the antics of the United States of America. And when we talk about Zelensky being a president of Ukraine, do you think he was president because of his political prowess? You think he's president because of his education? Oh, yeah, he went to the World Economic Forum leadership school. The man was a male stripper, okay? He was put in that position because the United States of America knew that he could be the puppet necessary in order to create into effect the bigger picture. By the way, the power of this deep state was so deep and so powerful and so large that even President Trump himself could not see through it until he actually left office. Okay? Like, this is important to understand. The reach of these people is far and deep. This shouldn't surprise anybody. There's not a single person that should be surprised when they see this, especially understanding what the scriptures say about the region and the future of the region, and knowing the track record of these people who represent this great republic. It's the truth.
Yanukovych becomes the enemy of the neocons, obviously. So they start working, of course, the way that the U.S. does. We got to get rid of this guy. Maybe we'll elect his opponent afterwards. Maybe we'll catch him in a crisis and so forth. And indeed, at the end of 2013, the U.S. absolutely stokes a crisis that becomes an insurrection and then becomes a coup.
Yeah, and just so you understand, the United States of America is, in essence, the only superpower in the world that creates the conduit for regime change. This is their policy. We did this in Benghazi. We've done this all over the country, right? It was done in Egypt with Shawarat Tahrir. It happened. It's happened all over the world. As a matter of fact, we just recently caught wind of the fact that the United States of America was in secret talks with Abdullahian of Iran to create regime change in Israel. This is their solution to the Gaza problem. And you wonder why the United States of America is cursed? You wonder why we're having these problems? They are in the business of regime change. This is what they do. This is exactly what they do. And the path that it took to get to Zelensky was a crazy one. Remember, when Zelensky first campaigned, he campaigned on maintaining neutrality and keeping peace with Russia. I mean, think about that for a second. Because what was placed prior to him was moving in a different direction. Yeah. But guess what? We all know his price. We all know what it took for him to get to where he needed to get to. This is what it's all about. The United States of America is all about coups. It's all about regime change. It's been this way for literal ever. It's been this way forever. Listen to what he says here. It's pretty profound.
And I know, again, from firsthand experience, the U.S. was profoundly implicated in that. But you can see our senators standing up in the crowd like if Chinese officials came to January 6th and said, yes, yes, go. You know, how would we like it if Chinese leaders came and said, yeah, we're with you 100%. American senators standing up in Kiev saying to the demonstrators, we're with you 100%. Victoria Nuland famously passing around the cookies, but it was much, much more than the cookies, I can tell you. And so the U.S. conspired with a Ukrainian right to overthrow Yanukovych, and there was a violent overthrow in the third week of February of 2014. That's when this war started. This war didn't even start in 2022. It started in 2014. That was the outbreak of the war, was a violent coup that overthrew a Ukrainian president that wanted neutrality.
I agree with him 100%. This proxy nonsense has been happening well into that time. Well into that time. He's 100% right.
He was violently overthrown, and his security people told him, you're going to get killed. And so he flew to Kharkiv and then flew onward to Russia that day. The U.S. immediately, in a nanosecond, recognized the new government. Oh, this is a coup. This is how the CIA does its regime change operations. So this is when the war starts. Putin's understanding, completely correct in this moment, was, I'm not letting NATO take my naval fleet and my naval base in Crimea. Are you kidding? The Russian naval base in the Black Sea, which was the object of the Crimean War, and
yes,
in its way is the object of this war, in Sevastopol, has been there since 1783. And now Putin's saying, oh, NATO's going to walk in? Hell no. And so they organize this referendum of this is a Russian region, and there's an overwhelming support. We'll stay with Russia, thank you, not with this new post-coup government. An outbreak breaks out in the eastern provinces, which are the ethnic Russian provinces in the Donbass, in Lugansk and Donetsk. And there's a lot of violence. So the war starts in 2014. So saying something's unprovoked in 2022 is a little bizarre for anyone that actually reads a normal newspaper to begin.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, how in the world does anybody have the nerve to say that this was unprovoked? There is no way in the world that this was not unprovoked. As a matter of fact, all of this went in the direction of provocation. They have been pushing and poking and prodding and forcing and whipping Putin and Russia the whole way through. Guys, do you understand that a lot of Ukrainians don't even want to see this happen? An overwhelming majority of Ukrainians don't want to see this happen. Some of Russia's greatest intel that's coming their way is coming straight out of Ukraine. Yeah, folks. Yeah. But then you have these moronic fools like Lindsey Graham, who's running around and saying things like, yeah, we should go kill Putin, right? It's insane. These people are literally nuts. And the worst part about it is somehow, some way, the American people, I don't know why, continue to vote for these fools. But if you really keep this in mind, understand, the ones that we vote for in many cases aren't the ones running things. That's the crazy thing here, right? That's just what's happening. But there's biblical precedent to this, right? All of these men are going to plot. All of these men are going to seek to do the things that they're wanting to do, but God will have the final say, and God will judge. And that is precisely what's coming. That's what's happening, folks. Yeah, it's coming. Listen to what he says next.
But in any event, the war starts then, and within a year, the Russians are saying very wisely, we actually don't want this war. We don't want to own Ukraine. We don't want problems on our border. We would like peace based on respect for the ethnic Russians in the East and political autonomy, because you, the coup government, tried to close down all Russian language, culture, and rights of these people after having made a violent coup. So we don't accept that. So what came out of that was...
So by the way, just so that you know, this, of course, at the time is the Russian Federation literally fighting for the interests of those that are in Ukraine who are, in essence, ethnic Russians. And that is most of Ukraine. So these are people who identify as Russians. They want to live as Russians. They want to act as Russians. They want to speak as Russians. They want to continue to be Russians living in Ukraine. Yet there are a group of people that want some autonomy. And this is Russia recognizing that the United States was the one that created the regime change. And instead of fighting what the United States did, going to take Ukraine and being forced to be there, they're willing to say, we'll treat Ukraine as a demilitarized zone. We'll actually honor Ukraine's autonomy as a coup government that you set up, so long as these areas are being honored. That's how far Ukraine went. By the way, this is around 2015 when this happens, okay? You have to understand, this is why 2016 was so critical for President Trump, and this is why Putin respected heavily President Trump, because President Trump knew how critical it was to honor those boundaries in keeping war from taking place, and that's why he was so good at handling NATO. That's why he spanked NATO, right? Very important that that be understood. Okay, let's continue on.
Two agreements called the Minsk I and the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was backed by the UN Security Council, and it said that we'll make peace based on autonomy of the Donbas region. Now,
by the way, one important fact about the UN Security Council, the Russian Federation the whole time worked with the UN Security Council. As a matter of fact, let me take it a step further. When Russia went into Ukraine in 2022, you know who the president of the UN Security Council was? It was Russia. So think about the implications of that, folks. Think about why this becomes such a big matter. You have to understand that many of these European nations, even those that are part of the UN and even the UN Security Council, and even many of the members of NATO, are technically standing by the United States of America because they have to, but they themselves understand the danger of what they're in the midst of. The United States of America doesn't care because they're on the other side of the world. It's a foolish way of looking at things because they don't understand how close they are to destruction. But you have to understand, the president of the United Nations Security Council was Russia. Look it up in 2022.
Very interesting. The Russians were not saying that's ours, we want that. All the things that are claimed every day that Putin just wants to recreate, he thinks he's Peter the Great. He wants to recreate the Russian Empire. He wants to grab territory. Nothing like that. The opposite. We don't want the territory. We actually just want autonomy based on an agreement reached with the Ukrainian government. So what was the U.S. attitude towards that? U.S. government attitude. U.S. government attitude was to say to the Ukrainians, don't worry about it. Come on, don't worry about it. You keep your central state. We don't want to see Ukraine weakened at all. We just want a NATO in a unified Ukraine. Don't go for decentralization. We tell them to blow off the very treaty that they've signed. Then we accuse Russia of not having diplomacy, by the way, which is, par for the course. Oh, you can't trust them. We blow off every single agreement. We blow off not moving 1 inch eastward. We blow off the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We have so many NATO-led wars of choice in between. I didn't even mention in Syria, CIA attempt to overthrow Assad, in Libya, and so forth. And we blow off the Minsk.
CIA's attempt in Syria, CIA attempt in Libya, CIA attempt in Egypt with Shwara Tahrir, CIA attempt in multiple nations in Africa, the craziness in little Somalia or Somaliland, South Sudan. We could just go on and 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 on. Folks, the reality of what this man is saying is grim. He's telling the truth here. It's astounding how brilliant his assertions are concerning all of this.
Agreements. And actually, Angela Merkel explained in a rather shockingly frank interview that she gave last year, when asked why Germany didn't help to enforce the Minsk agreement, because Germany and France were the guarantors of the Minsk agreement under something called the Normandy process. She said, well, we just thought this was to give some time to the Ukrainians to build up their strength. In other words, they were guarantors of something in a phony way, and the U.S. was absolutely lying about this. And I know senior Ukrainians who were in government and who were around the government who said to me, Jeff, we're not going to do that. Anyway, that was at gunpoint. We don't have to agree with that. So all that diplomacy was blown off. The war continued. The U.S. pumped in arms, built up armaments, was building up what would be the biggest army of Europe, actually, a huge army that Russia was watching. What are you doing? You're not honoring Minsk. You're building up this huge Ukrainian army.
Paid for by NATO.
Paid for by the United States, basically, yes. And
yeah, when he notice what he says, paid for by NATO, and he goes, paid for by the United States. Yes, this was the issue that Trump made a big stink of with NATO. He says, look, we fund NATO. We, in essence, are NATO. We give you an overwhelming majority of the money that you have. And the reality of it is, you're going to do what we tell you to. So all of the other presidents that were ran by these deep state, military industrial complex neocons were just basically telling NATO, you're going to help us invade. You're going to help us do the things that we're going to do. Remember, you're bound by Article 5 anyway, which, by the way, if you don't understand the tenets of Article 5, the idea is if one goes down, we all do. If one has to fight, we all fight. If one gets attacked, we all defend one another. It's basically NATO is a con right now of the United States to expand its own military forces through the use of coercion of other member states in the government for the alliances to simply be able to put into effect whatever they want to in this big game of command and conquer, or risk, as he would put it. That's what we're looking at here. It's very obvious what's going on. That's why they hated Trump so much, because Trump said, no, you're going to pay what you are obligated to pay, and we're not going to be looking to war. Think about that for a minute. Deep state hated Trump.
And in 2021, Putin met with Biden. And then after the meeting, he put on the table a draft Russia-U.S. security agreement. He put it on the table on December 15th, 2021. It's worth reading. Very plausible document. I don't agree with some of it. It's a negotiable document, something you would negotiate. I thought the core of it was stop the NATO enlargement. And I called the White House myself at that point.
Before he talks about calling the White House himself, let me just tell you, the core of the document is a request for them to honor the word that they gave in an existing agreement that was signed in the early 90s, folks. A condition of the dismantlement of the USSR was that NATO would not be expanded. There were even promises that were made for NATO to even welcome in Russia. So now here we are, many, many years later, where a document is being put together so that the diplomatic core of all the nations involved could get together and come to an amicable agreement to simply ask the United States to do what it had promised to do prior, but had broken his word. They're liars. They're liars. They've been lying. So for anybody who calls Putin some warmongering, power-hungry person, he made every attempt to mitigate that you can possibly imagine, to the point where he's saying, let's sit down at the negotiating table and negotiate you giving me even a portion of what you promised you were going to give me a long time ago. Yeah, folks, this is a problem.
And said, don't have a war over this.
Who'd you talk to?
I talked to Jake Sullivan, and I said, don't have a war over this. We don't need NATO enlargement for U.S. security. In fact, it's counter to U.S. security. The U.S. should not be right up against the Russian border. That's how we trip ourselves into World War III.
By the way, so you understand, the reason why it's counter to U.S. security is for multiple reasons. Number one, if NATO expands, then it puts us immediately on the border of Russia, which in and of itself is a very dangerous situation to be in, because if there is a war, then in essence, what begins to happen is we have to respond as the United States of America, because if anybody damages or hurts or targets us on any foreign soil, it is in essence a declaration of war, and we have to respond in kind. The other problem, which is the bigger problem, is if Russia, for whatever reason, finds itself in a position where it has to attack a NATO nation because of something that nation did, even unilaterally, the United States, per Article 5, has to respond by defending the interests of that NATO member, regardless of whether or not we wanted to. So it is indeed in the greater national security interest to not even be a part of NATO, to be honest with you. Remember, the formation of NATO was designed to create a defense against the USSR. The USSR is no longer there. The Russian Federation wants to work with the rest of the world. Guys, come on, guys. I don't know how hard this can be for people to get. But because of the propagandist lies that continue to be communicated, this is the conclusion that we come to. It's sad.
No, Jeff, don't worry. No war. There's not going to be a war. Don't worry. We've got a diplomatic approach. I said, Jake, this is a basis for diplomacy. Negotiate. Well, the formal response of the United States is that issues about NATO are non-negotiable. They're only between NATO countries and NATO candidates. No third party has any stake or interest or say in this.
Which, by the way, so you know, NATO used to say that if you want to sit down and experience any kind of diplomacy with any of us, you have to do it with us as an alliance. So you have to go to us, and it has to be the alliance. Even if you're somebody that wants to be a member of the alliance, you can't go to us and sit down at a a sort of a diplomatic table to come to a negotiation to produce something that would affect one of our nations. The reason why they say this is it has to be a multilateral effort, because if it's perceived as a unilateral effort, then it drags the rest of the NATO nations into the agreement, because they have to follow the subsets that are set forth by whatever diplomatic corps agrees to. And so the problem is they all have to work together. And this is why they don't want to get a candidate nation involved, because if you get a candidate nation involved, then they're going to want to manipulate NATO in order to produce whatever result they want, even though they're not a member of NATO, right? Well, then NATO changed their mind and said, well, no, we can enter into a discussion even with a potential member nation. So now the potential member nation can step into NATO and start twisting NATO around to accomplish whatever they want to. This is what's happening in Ukraine right now. Of course, Zelensky doesn't give a rip about his people. He doesn't care about Ukrainians. He could care less. He doesn't mind the fact that almost 1 million Ukrainians are dead. What he is doing right now within the particular context of which he's surrounding himself in is he is looking to manipulate every single member of NATO, and really specifically targeting the United States of America to continue on with his con, to make himself a little bit more rich. And of course, like you said, the death of diplomacy has already happened. There is no such thing as diplomacy anymore. We don't have any real diplomatic corps. That's just the way it goes. That's why Tucker is laughing. That's why he's sarcastically responding.
Russia, it's completely irrelevant. Again, to use the analogy, if Mexico and China want to put Chinese military bases on the Rio Grande, the United States has no right to interfere.
And no interest in it.
And no interest in it, and no bilateral. And this was the formal U.S. response in January 2022. So unprovoked, not exactly.
So
Completely. Come on. It was completely provoked. By the way, can I just say this again? This is what it looks like when people assume or take on the assumption of taking on the role of God. When you act like God, when you pretend as though you are God, this is what you produce. This is what you should expect to see happen.
30 years of provocation where we could not take peace for an answer one moment. All we could take is, we'll do whatever we want, wherever we want, and no one has any say in this at all.
So can I just go back 22 years? Putin told me, and I checked, I think it's true, that he, in Clinton's final days, asked Clinton if Russia could join NATO, which seems almost by definition like a victory.
Yeah.
NATO exists as a bulwark against Russia. If Russia wants to join the alliance, then you've won, right? Why would the U.S. government have turned that offer down? And do you think that is real?
Listen to what he says here. The answer to this is unbelievably eye-opening. Listen to what is said here.
Russia, and actually Europe, used to want, before Europe was completely a kind of vassal province of the United States government, wanted what they call collective security, which was, we want security arrangements in which one country's security doesn't ruin the security of another country. And there were two paths to that. There were basically three paths, let's say. One path was what they call the OSCE, the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. Really a good idea. It's Western Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and former Soviet Union. And the idea was, let's bring us all together under one kind of charter and we'll work out a collective security arrangement. I liked it. I mean, this is what Gorbachev was saying. We don't want war with you. We don't want conflict with you. We want collective security. Second arrangement that actually makes a lot of sense, but people say, is this guy out of his mind? But it actually makes a lot of sense. Gorbachev disbanded the Warsaw Pact. We should have disbanded NATO. Said NATO was there to defend against a Soviet invasion. There's not going to be any Soviet invasion. In fact, after December 1991, there's not even a Soviet Union. We don't need NATO. Why is there NATO? NATO was established to defend against the Soviet Union.
Right.
So why did it continue after Gorbachev and Yeltsin? The neocons thankfully, thank you, read the document. It's all explicit. This is our way of keeping our hegemony in Europe. In other words, this is our way of keeping our say in Europe, not protecting Europe, not even protecting us. This is hegemony. We need our pieces on the board. NATO's our pieces on the board.
Why would Germany allow foreign troops garrisoned on its soil for 80 years? I don't understand. Why would European country allow that?
You have to understand, guys, with the dismantling of the Warsaw Pact and the what would appear to be the insanity of it. Remember, these are people in Russia that are willing to do anything to enter into a place of peace rather than to be in the position that they were in prior. Okay? It's just amazing. Now listen to the question that Tucker asked with respect to Germany, because this becomes very consequential. And we're almost done with this portion of the interview to bring it all home, because this should really expand your understanding of Ezekiel 37. I keep saying 37. Ezekiel 38. I don't know why I keep saying 37. It should expand your understanding of Ezekiel 38 when you begin to see how this is all geopolitically forming. It makes so much sense. And I'm going to explain why in a minute. All of what you're hearing and seeing right now is spiritual. We're going to get into this. Why in the world won't they just go down the path of least resistance? Why can't they do the most obvious thing? Because it's spiritual. We'll talk about that in just a second. Pay attention to what is actually said here. It's pretty powerful stuff. Powerful in the fact that it's eye-opening, right? It's like unbelievable when you think about it.
Would you want foreign troops in your town?
Tucker, when you had your wonderful interview with Putin.
Notice how we refer to the interview that Tucker had with Putin as being wonderful. Folks, I think that interview was wonderful too. I think that interview was super eye-opening because Putin was being very, very, very truthful and open and candid about everything that's going on. His history lesson was remarkably critical to defeating the overall narrative that's based on a whole bunch of propagandist lies. So yes, it was a beautiful interview. And if you want to see that interview, I actually provided a bunch of commentary on that interview, the entire interview between Putin and Tucker. And guys, it was a great interview. Really was. Oh, let's continue on.
This and knowing all the leaders, and I know Schultz and I know others, I don't understand it, but when the U.S. has a military base in your country, it really pulls a lot of the political strings in your country. It really influences the political parties. It really pays. I know I'm naive. In other words, the Germans they're not free actors in this. That's the point.
The Germans have never been free actors, even during Nazi Germany.
Showed up in your apartment in New York and just camped out there, you probably wouldn't really be the head of your household anymore, would you?
It's probably true, but your question of why would the Germans want this? It's the same question of after the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, why wouldn't the Germans?
After the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, notice how he just says it just nonchalantly. He's right. It was the United States that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. We have the evidence. We've watched it. I've done shows with the guy that can prove it.
Have said before or after, why did you do that? This is our economy you just blew up. But they don't. And so they're so subservient to the U.S. interests. It's a little hard to understand because it makes no sense for Europe. But like you said, there are armed people in your house. Maybe that's the bottom line. I've spoken to European leaders who have said to me, I can't quote it because it's so shocking, and I won't quote it because it was said confidentially, but basically, they don't take us seriously in Washington. And I said, yes. I didn't say it was the bubble over my head speaking to a European leader, but maybe if you pushed a little bit, you would be taken more seriously, not in this way of just defeat. But it was said to me in such a sad way. I just felt, oh God, don't tell me that. You're a leader in Europe.
But we're occupying their country with soldiers and guns. How could we take them seriously? There are I mean, honestly.
No, I don't know. It's really sad, and it's doing a lot of damage to. It's doing huge damage to Europe. It's destroying Ukraine, by the way. That's the first point. It's destroying Ukraine. It's doing a lot of damage to Europe. It's wasting a hell of a lot of lives and money in the United States, which the neocons don't count. And almost nobody stands up and talks about it. And your first question about being unprovoked, we even have a story about it. The story's complete bull. It's complete nonsense. It's for people who don't want or don't want to remember anything before February 24th, 2022. But there's a whole long history to this that's absolutely kind of absurd and tragic. I mean, it's absurd. It's utterly tragic. 500,000 Ukrainians dead for nothing.
Do you think that's the number?
I think that's probably the number, yeah. That's the best number that I know.
I think that number is probably closer to 1 million. I think there's a lot of good data out there that shows that number is closer to 1 million. That's what I think.
I mean, we talked about this last night at dinner, but one of the most shocking things, just as someone who lived in Washington, to me, is if you ask any of the senators, as I have, who voted to keep this war going with U.S. tax dollars, how many of your beloved Ukrainians have been killed? They have no idea, and they have no interest in knowing.
And they don't care at all. And sometimes they say they don't care. Mitt Romney said, it's greatest bargain, no American lives. Dick Blumenthal said the same thing, basically. This is a great bargain, no American lives.
But isn't that evil?
It's the greatest bargain, no American lives. Let's let all the Ukrainians die, so long as American lives don't die. And by the way, the only reason why they're happy about no American lives is because of the political capital that would take, right? It has nothing to do with the idea that they're concerned about human life, period, even the human life of their fellow citizens. They're all concerned about the political capital that's involved. That's why they call it a freebie.
Well, I mean, at some point, it's certainly hypocritical. They're telling us we're doing this for Ukraine, for our friends in Ukraine, the standard bearers of democracy. But also, don't you have an obligation to kind of care about the people you kill?
I think so. You think so. I think Americans think so. I don't think that the security apparatus thinks so, because the security state, you got to be tough to play that game of risk. You got to know, is there going to be some collateral losses? Millions of people have died in American wars of choice. But if you're a big boy, you can't let that deter you. So I think it's pretty deeply ingrained that a few 100,000 lives here and there, come on, we're talking about who runs the world after all.
It's really, really dark.
I think it's extraordinarily reckless.
Just to circle back, but also, look, if the pretext for all of this is some sort of moral authority, we're for democracy, they're for authoritarianism.
This has nothing to do with morality. This has nothing to do with morality. It has nothing to do with Western values. It has nothing to do with American values. It doesn't even have to do with American interests from what I can see, although it says that they say that American interests are at stake. Well, we've spent maybe $7 trillion on these reckless perpetual wars since 2001. Is that really? We've added to the debt. The debt's gone from about 30% of national income to more than 100% of national income. We've had these disastrous wars. Is this America's interest? No. I mean,
no.
Maybe we could have actually rebuilt a bridge or a road along the way, or
it destroyed our country.
Even had a mile of fast rail in our country or something. But no, we had to spend trillions and trillions on wars. So to my mind, it's all completely perverse. But what I find amazing is that once in a while, you have to look, but once in a while, you'll actually find the truth expressed in such a vulgar way. No, they don't count the Ukrainian lives. They literally say no American lives. We're not even so sure about that, by the way, but
Americans have died.
Yeah, it's not a large number, but it's some, but they don't tell us the truth about that either.
Okay, I think this is a really, really, really good place to sort of bring it all together and make some sense. You notice what he says. He says they're not doing it for moral reasons. He says they're not doing it for any of these reasons. What they're actually doing it for is, in essence, wicked. When you look at the discernible truth shows how dark and how evil all of this is. And this goes back to the point that I want to close on, folks. And that's the fact that this is spiritual. That is a fact that the Bible tells us that as we get closer to the last days, we are going to see the increase of these type of wicked things. And you have to understand that even when you look at a portion of Ezekiel 38, just as we read Ezekiel 38, folks, look what it says. Look what Ezekiel 38 tells us. And I'm going to read this because this is really critical to understanding what it actually says here, because you're not going to really understand the nature of why this is happening if you don't recognize the spiritual portion of this, right? So let's read this, Ezekiel 38, right? And we're talking about all of these nations coming against. I'm going to read this right from the very beginning. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against them, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, and all them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, and all of them handling swords, Persia, Ethiopia, Libya with them, and all of them shield and helmet. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah, the north quarters, all his bands, and the many people with thee. Be thou prepared, and prepare for thyself, thou and thy company that are assembled unto thee, and be thou a guard unto them. Folks, the picture, especially with the hook, is that this is all spiritual. And if God allows this attack to take place through what he creates, the condition that is put here because of man's ungodliness, understand this is a mechanism of what is spiritual. And what we're seeing right now in the world around us is not supposed to make sense. It doesn't make sense because it's spiritual. What we're seeing is spiritual. And if there's anything I want to tell you after looking at this video, it's this. More than ever, I'm begging you, we don't have time. We are running out of time. I want you guys, please, I'm begging you, study the word of God. Know what God's word says about all these parts of the world. Know what God's word says about the behavior of mankind. Understand the requirements that God has set forth in every area. Know the word of God because time is running out. Folks, that's what it's all about. And that's why I do this YouTube page. That's why I spend lots of time with you one-on-one, seeking to educate you and getting you to understand the things that I'm learning and understanding. We're doing this together. We're going through this journey together because I'm telling you, we are in that time and day. The Lord could come back at any moment and we need to be prepared, and it's all happening in front of us. So I want to beg you guys to pay attention. Listen, I'm going to attach to this video some really good material. The interview that Tucker had with Putin, I've got that. I've got another interview that Tucker did when he was interviewed about his interview with Putin that brings a lot of good insight, and some other things related to the region with Iran and Persia. I'll put a bunch of those links up so that you have them, so that you can dig a little bit deeper and understand a little bit more about the things that are happening right now. Because guys, I need you to make a bigger investment in your education in the Word of God so that you will be ready to deal with these things as they come your way. All right? God bless you guys. Keep fighting the good fight, and always look to the Lord because he could come at any moment. God bless you.